So hi, everyone. I'm going to wait a few more minutes just to see if we get a few other people. Philosophers and academics are not known for being early or on time, so I like to give people a little bit of a buffer and see if people join us. So I'll start running through my remarks, which people don't really need to be here for, but I'm going to make them anyway, and gives people a little bit extra time to get here. So hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Canadian Society for the Study of Practical Ethics webinar, and for the AGM as well, if you're staying on for that, which would be great. My name is Melanie Banks, and I'm the president of the CSSPE. So just a little bit about us. If you're new, the CSSPE was formed in 1987. So we're, I think, 34 years old. I was trying to work out the math this morning, which means we should probably do something big next year for our 35th. So we've been around for quite a while. We're committed to the study of all major areas of practical ethics, as well as addressing ethical issues and concerns that arise in the humanities, social sciences, professions, and other areas of activity and learning. We are also interdisciplinary, which is really important to us, and we welcome members from not only academia or not only sort of traditional philosophy, ethics backgrounds, but all backgrounds, and from the professional world and from beyond. We all should be having conversations about ethics, we think, so the more the merrier. Up until 2020, the CSSPE had a conference at this time of year at the Congress. And of course, because of 2020, that all changed. So this particular webinar today is our second last webinar, working with the speakers that were accepted to the conference that never happened. And we have one more on Friday, June 25th, which wraps up the end of that cycle. And then after we're done with those, we're actually now planning to do a webinar series for 2021, 2022. And you can find details about that one on the website, which is csspe.ca, under call for abstracts. And we'll be planning that out. It'll be every second month on a Sunday afternoon. And that's what we're working on right now. And just one little last piece of business, just a reminder, we do have a membership. It's been a little bit weird and crazy because this year has been weird and crazy for us. But moving forward, we have some new fee structures that we're using as long as we're online, and we're figuring out a way to have the pay ability be on the website as well. So we'll be talking about that more at the AGM. So before I introduce our first speaker, I just want to do a quick land acknowledgement, which is always a little bit funny in an online environment, but this should cover things more or less. So I would like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of the lands that we are on today, all of the different lands that we are on today. While we meet on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land, which we each call home. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this nation home. That should more or less blanket cover wherever we are coming from today. All right, so We're going to get on to the talks in just a second. So the format is that each speaker is going to have 40 minutes to cover their presentation, their paper, and then we'll do 20 minutes for Q&A. I'm going to keep my camera on the whole time unless my dog does something crazy or I have to run away, but I'll keep mine on. And I'll be timing you, which is always a little bit silly, but I'm going to do that. And then when you have like this is going to be backwards. I didn't even think about this. But anyway, the mirror image.
I don't see it as backwards, so it's okay.
It's all good. Yeah.
Fine.
But anyway, so I have a 5 minute, a 2 minute, and a time's up, all of which will be in mirror image format that I will hold up. Of course, you can end earlier if you'd like, but that way we maintain that you'll have at least 20 minutes for Q&A. For audience members, the question and answer will occur in the chat box. You can start asking questions at any time, although I recommend the speakers don't look at the questions until the end because it can be really distracting. And then you can kind of run your own Q&A by reading through the questions at that point and answering them. And I know sometimes people can do not secret chats, private chats and all sorts of other things as well. So if you know how to use the platform really well, take advantage of it. That's great. All right, that's all of my little blurb. Yeah, I think that's good. I still haven't given people 107. I gave them a few extra minutes to come in. I suspect they might still be coming. So today we have two exciting speakers. Our first speaker is Amber Spence from the University of Guelph, and Amber is going to present her paper, The Responsive Diversity Worker. So welcome, Amber.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. So I'm just going to get right into it. In my paper, I argue that Carla Fehr's concept of diversity worker should be broadened to include all women and minorities in academia, regardless of research interests, in order to address the disproportionate amount of emotional labor that such workers are implicitly expected to carry out. In so doing, I suggest that we refer to such workers as responsive diversity workers. So I summarize Fehr's view of the epistemic diversity worker in section 1. I develop a working theory of emotional labor in section 2 and explain how the responsive diversity worker is, by virtue of the unfair emotional labor that is expected of her, at great risk of developing mental health issues. So I'll just get straight into the section 1 then. So Fehr expands on Helen Longino's social epistemology. And I just want to say too, sorry, I forgot to mention that the paper that I'm referencing here, that I'm talking about here, is called What is in it for Me? The Benefits of Diversity in Scientific Communities. And that's by Carla Fehr. Sorry, I should have had it at the beginning. So Fehr expands on Helen Longino's social epistemology concerning the epistemic benefits of diversity within a community. The basic idea behind this view is that diversity within a community provides epistemic benefit. The assumptions, prejudices, and theoretical perspectives of the non-diverse members can be noticed and challenged. When Fehr uses the phrase diversity, she is particularly referring to the underrepresentation of women and feminist scholars in the academy. This includes some minorities, though only those whose work focuses on gender through a feminist lens. For Longino, a community is a group of people who come together to critically evaluate one another's scholarship. Such a community will give uptake to dissenting voices and treat each member with tempered equality of intellectual authority, which is to say that the social or economic position of someone shouldn't impact how seriously their perspective should be taken. Fehr worries that Longino's view of community is not detailed enough. She brings forward Helen Hankinson Nelson's view of an epistemic community as being focused on constructing and sharing knowledge and standards of evidence among its members. Such communities are multiple, historically contingent, and dynamic. They evolve, dissolve, and recombine, and have many purposes and projects which may or may not include the production of knowledge. Finally, they rarely have clear and defined boundaries. Typically, those sorts of communities will overlap. While this view of a community is more detailed, there still exists a potential problem. Because so many of these communities overlap, it's important to consider which communities need to cultivate dissenting voices. Fehr argues that it is possible for a community to enjoy the epistemic benefits of diversity without actually cultivating such dissent. So the problem becomes that one can interact with people of different social locations and theoretical perspectives without nurturing and increasing their representation by free riding off of existing diversity. This will make it hard to use diversity promotes excellence theories like Longino's to argue for more representation of women and some minorities in certain communities. So this is where Fehr believes that such theories have room for development. The type of community can be important for issues regarding representation of diverse workers. Fehr proposes two types of communities, formal and informal. In the context of academic and scientific communities, a formal community is one that is institutionally recognized and conducts the kind of activities acknowledged as contributions to the professional advancement of a faculty member. So formal communities can include being a student, a postdoctoral researcher, faculty member in an academic department, basically anything that you would want to put on a CV. Informal communities, on the other hand, are simply networks of people with whom we interact with and who can have an influence on our work. So this could be, informal student meetup groups or professional meetup groups, but it also could just simply be your family and friends. Within either community, one can be a marginal member, which is somebody who doesn't have much status or power, a central member who does hold status or power, or hold a perspective that includes both. And it's important to note that while marginal members can be considered diversity workers are not always going to be marginal members. So university departments are important formal communities, as this is the place where academics are paid for their epistemic labor. And herein lies the difficulty for Fehr. It is possible for one to reap the epistemic benefits of diversity from an informal community without ever having to increase the representation of diversity within one's formal community. So when this happens, often the diversity worker who provided the dissenting view in the informal community is not credited with having provided such a contribution. This means that they have done epistemic labor without compensation or professional advancement. Fehr calls this diversity free riding, and in some cases, the diversity worker may gain recognition or advancement through offering their voice of dissent, but even still, the person gaining from the diversity worker is free riding. So Fehr writes that the person being used as a source of diversity is doing what she calls epistemic diversity work. This definition covers a lot of ground, typically encompassing the sort of activities that are considered part of the everyday work, research, and service that is required of academics. The difference here is that the epistemic diversity worker is often doing their work in addition to the regular activities that academics engage in. The impact of free riding on a diversity worker depends both on the social location and the kinds of diversity that the worker is adding to the community. So a diversity worker who is a central member of a formal community will probably not sustain much damage by being the object of free riding or by turning down opportunities to do epistemic diversity work, as opposed to somebody who is a marginal member of an informal community. So free riding off such a member can have serious consequences for their professional development because it's time-consuming labor that uses up energy that could be used to further their own careers. So if free riding is common and continues to happen, it will end up decreasing the amount of diversity workers available to do this work, since it can impact their career trajectories in a negative way. And while it's true that epistemic diversity workers can decide not to engage in such work and withdraw from both formal and informal communities, the choices available to the diversity worker to either provide or withhold their service is constrained depending on the status and the kind of diversity being provided. Fehr's concept of an epistemic diversity worker does a few important things. First, she calls attention to the epistemic work that is being done without recognition by women and feminist scholars. Second, she's highlighting the inequity of epistemic diversity work and the unlikelihood of professional advancement. And third, she calls for more representation of diversity within our communities, especially our formal communities. Crucially, though, free riding off diversity workers in a marginal position means that diversity workers spend time and energy laboring on something that often will not receive recognition or professional advancement. And this could be why we see so many women leaving academia. There are two important things that this term leaves out. While epistemic diversity worker includes women or feminist scholars, it leaves out people who are minorities and those who do not work on issues relating to gender. This is important because such scholars often face a disproportionate workload in comparison to their cis white male counterparts, which is overlooked. This workload can be epistemic in nature, but need not be, such as the work an Indigenous scholar does in uncovering biases within research relating to Indigenous cultures. While there is certainly an epistemic element to this work, to say that this work is entirely epistemic is to miss an important and often exhausting component, which is emotional labor. So while I believe that Fehr's paper is an important contribution in discussions surrounding the leaky pipeline and the unique challenges that women and feminist scholars face in academia, I propose that her term epistemic diversity worker should be expanded to include people and the labor that it leaves out. So we're going into section 2 now, which is emotional labor. So following from my previous section, one may wonder what emotional labor entails. There seems to be an intuitive sense of emotional labor as being acts of caring that put strain on the agent carrying out such an act. For instance, perhaps one is having to show warmth and care in a situation that doesn't naturally incite the feelings in question. In this case, it seems that one would have to try and summon up such feelings to fit the situation, to try and feel what one thinks one ought to feel. According to Arlie Hochschild, this is indeed a big part of emotional labor. In her book, The Managed Heart, she suggests a view of emotional labor as the management of emotions with the purpose of either inducing or suppressing one's feelings in order to sustain the outward countenance that produces the proper state of mind in others. What makes emotional labor so challenging and straining is that in order to be successful at it, one has to reach deep to that part of self that is prized as a source of individuality and personhood in order to manage emotions in this way. If we were to engage in emotional labor in our personal lives, which is probably fairly common, I think that generally the payoff is at least close to being equal to the strain. And furthermore, we can stop when we need to. Other than what Hochschild calls feeling rules, there is nothing forcing us to continue. When this kind of work is forced through pressures relating to employment and career progression, however, emotion work becomes problematic and often very unequally distributed. For Hochschild, emotional labor is sold for a wage and therefore has exchange value. There are a few things to unpack here. I mentioned the term feelings a few times, but as a philosopher, we have to ask, what does it mean to say that somebody feels a certain way? I think Hochschild puts forward a compelling account of this. Feelings are a sense alongside our other 5. It's a bodily sensation called up by the situation we find ourselves in. And like our other 5 senses, it communicates information to us about our viewpoint on the world or situation we're in. In this way, feeling isn't something stored inside of us, nor is it independent of management. Rather, the act of getting in touch with feeling and the act of trying to feel may become part of the process that makes the thing we get in touch with, or the thing we manage, into a feeling or emotion. In managing feeling, we contribute to the creation of it. While I agree with Hochschild's definition of feeling as being a kind of sense, something that helps us better understand our viewpoints on the world, I'm still left wondering what it is that thing we get in touch with that turns into a feeling once we manage it. I suggest what we're missing here is what Herta Neubauer refers to as affect. She writes that affect is a non-conscious experience of intensity that traces its power from the fact that it is unformed and unstructured and cannot be fully realized in language. We experience it in our body before we're able to find a name for it based on the language our society has given us to express our sensation. Once named, it's then re-experienced through social relations and culture, and because of this, has an inherently reflexive, transitive, and intersubjective quality. I propose then that affect is that from which feeling arises, and is likely the sense of deep self that is considered the source of individuality and personhood, which Hochschild believes is used in emotional labor. I also mentioned something Hochschild calls feeling rules. This, I suggest, has a considerable part to play in the biases we hold, whether implicit or explicit, regarding who should be doing the emotional labor in private life, which has then spilled over into working life. Hochschild proposes that emotion management is guided by feeling rules, which are the standards used in emotional conversation to determine what is rightly owed and owing in the currency of feeling. Through them, we tell what is due in each relation and each role. Emotion management guided by feeling rules is often considered the domain of women in private life. As Hochschild writes, it's up to women to create the emotional tone of social encounters, expressing joy at the Christmas presents others receive, or creating a sense of surprise at birthday parties, for instance. These feeling rules are what women use to trade for economic support. So when it became more common for women to exist within the public working realm of society, the expectation was that they would continue to abide by the feeling rules expected in regular private life. That is to say, there was and still exists an expectation for women to pick up the emotional workload in the workplace. Women are expected to be caring, empathetic, warm, and approachable. That is not to say that men are never expected to abide by feeling rules. And in fact, I think that they have their very own set that guide their own emotion management. However, I suggest that the feeling rules applied to cis white men's management of emotion are less demanding in virtue of their manliness. They are not commonly expected to show emotional engagement and warmth in their working lives. And if they do, they are praised as going above and beyond the call of duty. These feeling rules are often what is cited as why women are more naturally fit for an occupation like teaching. And this bias is what leads women to women and minorities having to engage in far more emotional labor than that of cis white men in their teaching. Further, there is evidence that corroborates the additional emotional labor women do in the academic workplace, especially when we consider lecturing duties. So far, we have a working theory of emotional labor that conceptualizes it to be one, the managing of one's own emotions in order to manage the emotions of another. That two, this managing is often based on feeling rules, standards that tell us what we should or should not be feeling in any given situation. In order to do this, we must three, engage with the affect in our own and another's body before it can be translated into four, a feeling, which traditionally tells us how or what to think about the situation we are in. And because all of this is managed through feeling rules, the expectations around who is doing emotional labor are inherently gendered, meaning that women are at best implicitly expected to take on a larger emotional workload. Hochschild suggests that we participate in emotional labor through what she calls surface acting and deep acting. When we are surface acting, we use our facial expressions and body language to portray an emotion we don't actually feel. This kind of acting does not engage one's affect or one's feelings. For instance, Audrey Williams-June writes that scholars who are of a visual minority, such as Black and Hispanic academics, are often asked to serve on committees in order to provide everyone with their unique perspective, which their ethnic background affords them. So we can imagine a scenario in which a Hispanic professor, let's call him Professor Z, whose plate is overflowing with research, writing, and teaching commitments, is approached in this way for this purpose. I'm sure everyone can relate to being asked to add one extra thing on their towering to-do list. The difference is, though, that this extra thing is asking Professor Z not only to engage in yet another activity, but to engage in an activity whereby he is being asked to represent the ethnicity of his background. In such a case, we can imagine that the scholar in question quickly rearranges his facial expression to cover up his true feelings of exasperation and annoyance, to instead show a cheery and enthusiastic acceptance of the task. Inwardly, he has not attempted the deep emotion management of his feelings. He still feels annoyed and exasperated at being asked to do yet another task, and especially one in which he must represent his minority. He just doesn't look it. Deep acting, on the other hand, requires the deep kind of emotional management on oneself, as discussed above. In this case, the agent is actively trying to either induce or suppress a feeling in order to experience the emotion she believes the situation calls for. This involves reaching into the affect of one's sense of self and body to try and rise up a feeling suitable for the occasion or the situation, and then acting out that emotion in a convincingly spontaneous way. Let's consider for a moment what Lynn Yu Hua writes about her experience lecturing as a woman of color. According to Hua, both white students as well as students of color are susceptible to the cultural socialization that devalues the authority and contributions of women of color. This often means that at best, student resistance is operationalized as apathy, and in the extreme as open hostility. And yet, Hua, along with other lecturers who are women of color, must engage in the performance that is teaching. When she lectures these students, she must push down any negative feelings she may be experiencing in the face of the lack of enthusiasm or outright hostility coming from her students, and instead create a genuine feeling of passion, enthusiasm, and care, as these emotions are obligatory as a measure of her competence, professionalism, and collegiality. This sense of vibrancy that is necessary is a perfect example of the ways in which women and minority scholars engage in deep acting as a part of their job requirements. And while the management of the university, the dean or the chair, may not be actively managing the emotions of its where am I here? There we go, of its faculty members, the student gaze, as Coster calls it, does a thorough job of ensuring that women and minority faculty are working hard to produce the appropriate emotions the students feel entitled to receive. It may be the case that white cis men who are academics also engage in various forms of surface acting and deep acting. However, the main difference here is that they are not called on to engage in emotional labor to the same extent and for the same reasons as women and minorities. As Hewer writes, in cases where the teaching evaluations of female professors appear to be or close to being on par with those of male professors, a more careful examination shows that women have had to labor harder to satisfy student expectations. Students often penalize women and minority professors if their expectation of care is, or in other words, the feeling rules are not met. Because cis white male professors do not have such high expectations on them based on these feeling rules, they do not have to engage in this surface or deep acting as much or to the same extent as women and minority scholars do. According to Hochschild, many use what she calls emotion memory to ensure their deep acting is successful. In cases where it may be difficult to call up the appropriate feeling, we can instead recall a particular memory with a strong emotional connection to it and dwell on that memory and emotion as if it were still true in the present. So when Professor Z walks into the committee room where he is expected to provide his mainly white colleagues with his unique Hispanic perspective, he is likely engaged in deep acting. I am a white woman, as you can see, so I can't pretend to know what it's like to be in the situation that Professor Z finds himself in, to be asked to represent one's ethnic community. However, I can imagine that it is probably upsetting and frustrating in the extreme. In such a case, though, Professor Z is likely to try and suppress his feelings of frustration and annoyance, and instead bring forth a feeling of general goodwill and passion or enthusiasm. In order to do this, he may call up an emotion memory. He may want to remember the joyous moment he received his first big job as a professor and the feelings of satisfaction, elation, and happiness that memory calls up. He may then engage in an as-if scenario. Imagine as if I were standing in front of this group to be congratulated for the success I've achieved. This may help him call up the real emotions he's seeking in order to get the job done. It's important that the emotions called up appear genuine. Otherwise, they will lose the spontaneity that is required in order to be successful deep acting. Coster suggests two ways that we can think of emotional labor as playing out. The first is everyday emotional labor, which is managing one's own emotions by surface acting or deep acting. The second she calls extraordinary emotional labor, which is managing one's own emotions through either surface and or deep acting, as well as managing the emotions of others through spontaneous emotion and care. I think that this distinction is helpful when considering the practical ways that emotional labor happens and gives us a simple way to become aware of the ways in which we are being asked to work using emotion. So women and minority scholars are called on to engage in and provide both everyday and extraordinary emotional labor on a fairly regular basis in order to complete the work they are paid to do. The same work, I might add, that cis white male academics are expected to do with far less emotional labor. I've mentioned some of the ways in which women are called on to do this work, and indeed are expected to emotionally labor in their role as professor, scholar, and general academic. I've also addressed how it is that women of color face a similar, though unique problem, and that they are doubly hindered by the social expectations placed upon them, both through their roles as women and as people of color. And through my example of Professor Z, I hope I've also shown how it can be the case that men of color too must engage in a disproportionate amount of emotional labor by virtue of their ethnicity. According to institutional research data from the Southern Illinois University, when there were about 3,000 Black undergrad students enrolled, there were only 31 Black tenured or tenure-track professors. This is a ratio of 100 to 1. This means that there are woefully few faculty members who these students can look up to as representing them and their social location by virtue of their minority. June writes that the hands-on attention that many minority professors willingly provide is an unheralded linchpin in institutional efforts to create an inclusive and learning environment and to keep students enrolled. That emotional labor reflects what has been described as cultural taxation, the pressure faculty members of color feel to serve as role models, mentors, and even surrogate parents to minority students, and to meet every institutional need for ethnic representation. So we're going to go into my final section, section 3. This is where I talk about the responsive diversity worker. So in this section, I argue that the term diversity worker should be inclusive of all women and minority scholars, regardless of their research interests. In light of this, I suggest we rework Fehr's concept of the epistemic diversity worker to fit more closely to the emotional labor that women and minority scholars are called on to do. In arguing this, I recognize a different side of the diversity worker coin, responsive diversity work. I then suggest that this responsive diversity work is often damaging to the worker's mental health and thereby highlights a possible cause for the phenomena of the leaky pipeline. So far, I have shown that women and minorities in academia are called on to engage in everyday and extraordinary emotional labor far more often than their academic peers. And in light of this, I argue that the term diversity worker should encompass all women and minority academics, since not only is their presence within higher education technically diverse due to lack of representation, but importantly, their contribution of emotional labor within the academy is unique to their position as diverse members of the formal and what I will call mid-formal communities. In section 1, I discussed what Fehr calls formal and informal communities. So recall that a formal community is of a kind that participation in such a community would find its way on a CV, whereas an informal community can be anywhere from participation in an informal reading group to engaging with a group of one's personal friends. Since the exploitation of the emotional labor of diversity workers in formal and mid-formal communities is what concerns me, I will leave discussions of the informal community out of the conversation for the purposes of this paper. In explaining what I take emotional labor to mean in section 2, I've also shown how it is that diversity workers are called on to engage in far more emotional labor than their academic peers. Often this emotional labor includes supporting, mentoring, and teaching students. But beyond this, emotional labor can also include surface acting when confronted with the request to engage in more service activities, something which is predominantly taken on by women in academic departments, as well as supporting colleagues when they're feeling overwhelmed or lost in their research. It can also include dealing with microaggressions due to their sex, gender, ethnicity, and so on. Using both surface and deep acting while trying to deal with inequities and micro inequities, such as being talked over or not having one's ideas being granted serious uptake. And being implicitly responsible for combating instances of micro inequities through micro affirmations, that is, small acts of encouragement to help others succeed, such as opening doors to opportunity, gestures of inclusion and caring, and graceful acts of listening. I say that micro and affirmations probably fall to the emotional workload of women and minorities due to the feeling rules associated with this group of diverse workers within academia, which holds them to be responsible for providing care, warmth, and friendliness, as discussed in previous sections. Such emotional labor is extensive, exhausting, and largely unrecognized. Even diversity workers who hold central positions in formal communities must contend with the mental and physical drain of emotional labor. But for women and minorities in precarious working conditions, such as short-term contract work, this emotional labor is far more troubling. While it is true that under Fehr's definition, the diversity worker who is employed in a short-term contract is technically a member of a formal community, I suggest they're not full members of that community. They do not have the space to engage in the emotional labor they are implicitly required to do, as they are not paid the same way or the same amount as faculty members of a department. Because of this, they do not have the freedom to pursue areas of research and publish from that research in the same way that full faculty members do. They are paid to teach, and that is all they have the time to do. And the pay offered to teach one course is not enough to cover the cost of living for a family for the duration of the course. They must supplement their income, thereby exerting further pressures on their time. In Ontario, the contract professors are also not part of the same union and collective bargaining unit as that of full faculty members. For instance, they do not get the option to vote whether or not to strike alongside their colleagues in a department. Due to this, I argue that precarious workers exist in a halfway point between an informal and a formal community. They are in a mid-formal community. Taking into consideration the time and financial constraints on the regular precarious worker and the ways in which such constraints lend to the challenge of publishing enough so as to gain more stable employment within a university, it's clear that the addition of the extra emotional labor that is expected from a diversity worker prevents even more problems. Not only is the diversity worker in precarious employment implicitly expected to take on the time-consuming activity of both everyday and extraordinary emotional labor, but she is expected to do so alongside the research work she must do without pay in order to try and gain employment within a formal community. This thereby entails that the diversity worker is expected to take on this extra emotional labor without any compensation, formal recognition, as it cannot be added to a CV, and any chance of professional advancement. Like Fehr's epistemic diversity worker, what I will call responsive diversity work is done in addition to the regular professional activities of a scholar. While engaging in emotional labor cannot be used for professional advancement, not engaging in it can be detrimental to obtaining further employment. The diversity worker in precarious employment must in part rely on her teaching evaluations to ensure future employment, whether that is through renewing an existing contract with the same university, seeking further contract work at other universities, or applying for the coveted tenure track position in a university department. It's easy to see how the responsive diversity worker, especially though not exclusively those who inhabit a mid-formal community, is in a double bind. They're damned if they do the emotional work, and they're damned if they don't. The formal community of a department is important, as Fehr points out, because this is the place where the diversity worker gets paid for the epistemic labor and, as I argue, the emotional labor they do. Recall Fehr's description of a diversity free rider. Either an individual or a community makes use of existing diversity without increasing the diversity of any formal community, or without increasing the total representation of diverse voices. In the case of the responsive diversity worker who exists in a mid-formal community, I suggest that the formal community that surrounds them free rides off of her diversity by virtue of benefiting from the emotional labor that she does on behalf of the department. One possible solution to this, of course, is to bring more responsive diversity workers into the formal community, which would entail hiring diversity workers to fulfill tenure track positions in an academic department. While responsive diversity workers would still face a disproportionate amount of emotional labor and thereby face the mental and physical exhaustion from doing that labor, they would at least be getting paid enough to allow them to pursue other avenues of work, such as research, publishing, attending conferences, and so on. It would also mean that should they slip up or choose not to engage in the level of emotional labor that their students, for instance, are calling for, the possibility of a negative teaching evaluation would not mean the difference between a working contract and no working contract at all. I've used the term responsive diversity work to refer to the disproportionate emotional labor diversity workers, that is, women and minorities within academia, are expected to do. I've shown that much of what Fehr argues concerning the epistemic diversity worker can also be applied to the emotional labor diversity workers are called on to do. As such, I argue that we should consider the term diversity worker to include all women and minority academics, rather than only women and feminist scholars whose work focuses on issues relating to gender, and that my concept of a responsive diversity worker is to go alongside Fehr's epistemic diversity worker, as opposed to replacing it or existing independently of it, by way of expanding her diversity promotes excellence theory she develops. An important deviation from Fehr's concept of an epistemic diversity worker involves her remarks concerning free riding off such a worker who is a central member of a formal community. Recall that for her, this can be considered permissible because the diversity worker in question can refuse the work without the likelihood of negative consequences, and the free riding probably won't hinder her professional advancement. I argue that this is not entirely the case with a responsive diversity worker who inhabits the same position within a formal community. While it is true that a responsive diversity worker in such a position, for instance, a full professor, is not harmed in her career trajectory or professional advancement through the extra emotional labor she is called on to do, it does not mean that such a disproportionate amount of emotional labor should be considered permissible. Part of the problem with such emotional labor is its likelihood of leading the diversity worker to a feeling of estrangement, which can result in emotional exhaustion, burnout, and other negative effects to mental health. That we employ the management of emotion in the workplace has already been established in Section 2. The link that connects our emotion management in our private lives to the way we are encouraged to manage emotion for the purposes of work is what Hochschild refers to as the transmutation of an emotional system. When we use our feelings for organizational engineers of worker-customer relations, or in this case, worker-student or worker-colleague relations, then we risk losing signal function of feeling. Recall that feeling is often that which informs us on what we should think in any given situation. This thereby presents some confusion and difficulty in the use of our emotions and whether or not we should trust them. Hochschild writes that when the transmutation works, the worker risks losing signal function of feeling. When it does not work, the risk is losing the signal function of display. This can lead to feelings of estrangement or alienation from emotion for the responsive diversity worker. Hochschild explains that to manage one's emotions regarding the range of feeling in one's private life is to participate in an intricate private emotional system. When aspects of this system are used in the workplace and sold as human labor, they become stretched into standardized social forms. In these forms, a person's contribution of feeling is thinner, less freighted with consequence, but at the same time is seen as coming less from the self and being less directed to. It is more susceptible to estrangement. I think what is of particular importance in this passage is Hochschild's mention of what we have been calling affect, that is the bodily sensation that is indescribable in language, which through the managing of it gives rise to feeling. I've argued that affect is that part of feeling which comes from our innermost self. So the consequence of the emotional labor that the responsive diversity worker must engage in is the risk of becoming estranged from their emotions and as such from themselves. Their emotions end up being experienced as something shallower. Our emotions in this experience seem to come not from our affect where they usually originate, but rather from our feelings. Hochschild writes that in order to survive in their jobs, they must mentally detach themselves, the factory worker from his own body and physical labor, and the responsive diversity worker from her own feelings and emotional labor. I propose that this detachment or alienation is at least in part to blame for the links between emotional labor and burnout that research has suggested. According to Koster, burnout is a unique type of stress reaction that can lead to job turnover, absenteeism, and low morale, and is linked to insomnia, increased use of drugs and alcohol, and physical exhaustion. To try and safeguard herself from all of the emotional labor she is called on to do with her students, Koster actually enrolled herself in a counseling course to better handle these emotionally charged situations, both for her own benefit as well as that of her students. Hewa addresses the situation she has experienced as a woman of color. I'm going to quote this passage here. Women faculty of color are pushed out by a state of unwell that manifests as fatigue, but that reflects a matrix of constant negotiation, of competing emotions and pressure. Unacknowledged by professional reward, promotion, or remuneration, women of color are rarely compensated for their work in a way that makes material difference, adding to their physical, emotional, and spiritual exhaustion. As I have argued, I think the remarks Hewa makes concerning the state of unwell, the constant negotiation of competing emotions, and the physical, emotional, and spiritual exhaustion experienced by women of color in academia can also be applied to varying degrees to the responsive diversity worker as a whole. Though I acknowledge that each subgroup within the umbrella term diversity worker will have their own unique experience of suffering, I contend that their suffering is a result of a shared, unacknowledged laboring, and as such is similar in nature. I believe that part of the problem concerning academia's inability to retain its diversity workers, otherwise known as the leaky pipeline, is due to this experience of estrangement as a result of the extra emotional labor they are implicitly expected to carry out alongside their other academic duties. And I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amber. That's such an interesting talk. So as a reminder, for your questions, if you put that in the chat box, that's the way that we'll be doing that. I don't see anyone there yet. So
my glasses. I thought I was done with them, but I'm not. So.
Okay. I'm gonna like sneak in and ask my question first.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I'm sharing. So one of the things I was really thinking about with your talk was this idea that like what we're seeing a lot of universities do right now is they're trying to hire in from a variety of areas that are underrepresented in the university, like straight to tenure track.
Right.
And normally part of my mind goes, well, that's fine, but that doesn't solve the problem, right? Because it's just like, let's just throw some more people in at the top and not figure out why it wasn't more diverse in the first place.
Yeah.
But actually with your paper, I start to think, well, maybe we can't rely on the normal way of people moving up through the positions, because these people who fit in these categories are going to be frustrated, or like we're going to have other issues. So I don't know if you can speak to like how we can get around that, because I don't know that always just completely circumventing the problem by hiring people in at the top is the best way, but you know, like something needs to be done there. So I'm curious to know what you think about that.
Thank you. That's a really good question. So it's actually something that I've thought a lot about. You know, I think that it's really difficult, right? Because even if, I mean, yeah, it's a nice thought to kind of get these diversity workers, for instance, into you know, tenure track positions right away. Like that absolutely is helpful in the sense of that precarious employment that I was talking about. But at the end of the day, in virtue of their minority, they are going to be expected to continue to do this extra emotional labor that I'm talking about, right? Like they're still going to be responsive diversity workers, regardless of what position they're occupying. And so, you know, I think that really what it comes down to is the expectations that are placed upon them by both colleagues in the department, but as well as students, and particularly students, because, you know, when you go in for your review meetings, for instance, they're looking at your course evaluations, right? So one way that I think we might start to combat this is to include in those review meetings, for instance, a recognition and an acknowledgement of the emotional labor that has been done or has been chosen to be opted out of, and to not penalize that person for opting out of that emotional labor. You know, so that could look like, okay, I see you have a really negative course evaluation here. Can you elaborate to me why that might be the case? And that person can then say, well, look, I've chosen not to respond to emails at midnight. I've chosen not, you know, and that sort of thing, right? And these are entirely reasonable things not to do, but things that might kind of come back to bite you for not doing. So I think that might be one way of going about relieving the strain of emotional diversity workers.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so there are 2 questions in the chat box.
Okay, do you want me to read them out, or you want to read them out?
You can.
Okay.
I mean, I can say, it always sounds funny when I'm just parroting other people's stuff. So
that's okay. All right. So Philip has asked, is emotional labor intrinsically debilitating, or may it not also be, as is often the case of artistic and athletic performance, for example, empowering? I think that's a really interesting question, Philip. Thank you for that. So I think that in some ways, absolutely, it can be empowering. You know, like I had an experience where I had a student who came to me because she was having some serious issues with her mental health, like social anxiety and stuff like that. And I was TAing for a class where the final project was like a really big group project. They were doing a podcast, and, you know, it was obviously something that would trigger her social anxiety. She came to me and she was, you know, she was crying, she was really upset. And like that situation was absolutely a situation where I was called on to provide extraordinary emotional labor. And it's something that after I left, I kept thinking about and wondering, did I do the right thing? Or, you know, like worrying about it. And you know, I think that at the end, when I saw her you know, able to succeed based on the resources that I provided her with and the support that I provided her with, which absolutely counts as emotional labor, I felt so good about being able to help her. So there was something really empowering about that experience, but that doesn't negate the strain that it placed on me and the amount of time that it took for out of my regular working life. And I think that that's really what concerns me there. So I hope that helps to answer your question.
Yeah, it does help. I found that emotional labor, I don't really like the term, but it helps me enormously in teaching. It's helped me.
Right.
You get to a point where you can just control your emotions so much that they give you a drive, but they don't impede your performance. And without that, I wouldn't be able to teach at all.
Yeah, and I totally agree. I think that everybody who teaches, like across the board, has to use their emotions in what they're doing, right? Like, especially, you know, everybody has off days. There are days where, though I love teaching, there are days where I really would rather not, right? And so you go in and you kind of put that mask on, and you do what you need to do, right? To do it. And by the end, generally, I end up feeling pretty good about teaching in that way, right? And so I think that that's, you know, that sort of regular emotional labor that spans across the board, I don't find particularly problematic. It's really when that emotional labor is kind of added on to that in the various ways that I discussed through, like micro affirmations, for instance, or listening, or you know, all sorts of little things that really do add up to being quite a lot, especially when they're taking your time and energy away from your regular workload that would lead you towards professional advancement. Thank you. So I'll go on to Craig, who says, this was a great talk. Oh, thanks. And it covered a lot of really good ground. I'm very sympathetic to the idea that because of the expectations imposed on a class, all of the members of the class deserve recognition. But I wondered, would that, should a recognition cement or refine those expectations? Maybe this is a cheap concern, but I'm curious about that sort of idea and about the possibility that some members of the class might object to being so classified. So are you just kind of as a counter question here, are you referring to the students in the class in this case, or?
I guess I was thinking broadly whether, and I'm very sympathetic. So this is like, you know, cleaning up at the margins. But if we say something like, if we go from saying there's a social practice, there's just these social costs being imposed on or being expected of everyone in this group, and not in this group, but in this group for a certain reason. And so we're going to make our kind of policy track that, whether there might be any effect of having the policy that sort of makes more concrete those expectations or allows them to spread.
I see what you're saying. Right, I see what you're saying. Yeah.
That was the question.
I think, yeah, I think that there is a danger of that for sure, kind of cementing this expectation. And I think that going into it, if that's kind of the way that we want to try and solve the issue, then I think that that's something that we would really need to be very aware of, so that we can actively kind of work against that. But I think too, like there are other ways in which this group of people, these group of diversity workers engage in emotional labor that are, you know, rewarded, you know, for instance, if you are, I heard of one instance, for example, where somebody was, a faculty member was on a committee to combat against sexual assault in the university. And I guess they were upholding some pretty patriarchal ideas about that. And they were kind of going above and beyond in order to perpetuate those ideas. And I mean, that counts as emotional labor, right? But because that emotional labor typically upholds the systems that we live under, that was very lucrative. That was a very lucrative thing to do. So I just want to kind of also say that there are certain forms of emotional labor that that do push you forward, right? But typically, at least in my humble opinion, those forms are maybe a little morally suspicious. But yeah, that's a great question. And I do think that you make a really great point. And yeah, it's something we should absolutely be aware of moving forward.
Thanks. Thanks again for the talk. Really great.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to go on to Diane. Are graduate students included in your conception of responsive diversity workers? Is their situation different given that it is not just their workplace, but also their educational institution? Yeah, excellent point. Excellent point, Diane. And yes, I would include graduate students in my term responsive diversity worker. And actually, I think that I would be inclined to put them in a kind of mid-formal community similar to the precarious workers that I was talking about earlier, only insofar as graduate students typically are not paid anything or are paid a very small amount for like teaching duties, for instance, like TAing, grading, things like that, right? And so while under Fehr's conception of the term, they technically exist in a formal community, for many of the similar reasons I talked about with regards to the precarious worker, I'm inclined to think that they actually belong in more of a mid-formal community. Yeah, I think that their situation, though, for graduate students does differ slightly insofar as they are there both to work, but also to learn. And in virtue of their learning, I think that can really complicate matters. Yeah, so I'm thinking about, for instance, like the sort of emotional labor female graduate students tend to do during classes, like classes that they themselves are taking in order to help support the other members in that group, defend them if need be, or even soften their approach. I've seen that happen I myself have done that quite a few times. And again, this sort of thing typically does not get you any kind of recognition. So it's again, kind of this outputting of labor that's not being recognized. But yeah, I think that's a really great question. Thank you.
I'm just noticing that Sandra has her hand up. I'm not sure if she wants to ask her question.
Yeah.
Katie, I don't know if you hear me. There you are.
Sorry, I've been having some difficulty using the chat thing because the only person I've been able to send messages to is Diane. So my question is, thanks to Diane in the chat box, but I do welcome the opportunity to thank you for an amazing presentation. It is dealing with such an important topic, and I'm quite passionate about this topic, actually, which apparently I'm not allowed to be, right? I'm being emotional, yeah. I'm being subjective.
Right.
My passion comes from witnessing systemic racism in the context of being in the presence of a colleague, an Indigenous scholar. I have been in her presence at conferences, in the classroom. I would invite her to my classroom, presentations to the undergraduate philosophical society, and so on. And because I know her and I know a little bit about systemic racism, yeah. I could witness the racism that she was experiencing. And these two things are very different. But one of the things that I am concerned about in the way in which the analysis of this problem seems to have gone is that one emotion, I think, can actually be expressed in words. And it's perhaps the most important emotion we can have in the context of moral problems. And that's our sense of justice, which can appear as anger or frustration. But if we can call it injustice and prove it is injustice, then I think the idea that the person who is experiencing this should pretend that's not their emotion is oppression upon oppression. And while I agree that in the academic context, it is epistemically unwise in terms of being respected by your colleagues and your students to be passionate and expressing a sense of frustration at injustice. If we as human beings cannot express honestly and with integrity that emotion, what kind of a university or society will we end up with?
Yeah, I totally agree with everything you just said. I absolutely agree. I think that it's exactly from what you mentioned here about, like, having to suppress those kind of feelings of injustice or that stem from injustice in order to get those good course evaluations or in order to move forward. Or, I mean, that is what, to me, makes the situation morally impermissible. I don't think that it's okay. Yeah, I do not think it's all right at all. And so I hope that in pointing out what I try and point out with this paper, that I can really kind of push people to really start considering the consequences of this kind of expectation on these diverse workers. And hopefully we can push people to start making some real changes in the way that we place these sorts of expectations on people.
Melanie, is there time for me to ask my question that builds on Andrew's work, or are we out of time, or is there somebody else?
We still have a few more minutes, and no
Are
one else.
there other questions though?
No, not yet. So ask.
Okay, then I will ask this one, because the reason that I think it might be important is that it kind of connects with what we've just been talking about. Andrew has been making some very fine presentations on the power of narrative in creating, understanding, and communicating knowledge. And the reason that in the context of your work, I think providing a narrative, a story, a real person experiencing this horror at the beginning might have the advantage of generating a sense of injustice in the reader.
Right.
And if you can do that at the beginning, like as soon as I came into your paper, 2 sentences in, you had me. But it's in part because of my experience, and it would be nice if you could grab someone who hasn't had, it's weird to call it a privilege, but in terms of gaining knowledge, it has been a privilege to be in Lorraine's company when she's been experiencing racism. And, from people that, come on, guys, and I use that word not to cover both sexes. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that, thank you so much for that suggestion. I agree. And I think that the reason why that's such a great suggestion is because, as under my definition, at least, as diversity workers ourselves, responsive diversity workers ourselves, it's not hard for us to come up with instances where we can identify with what I'm talking about. But for somebody who maybe is not a diversity worker, it might be a little bit more difficult to place themselves in that sort of situation. So I think that using a testimony would really, really help, like even just epistemically, right? Like help somebody get into that. So yeah, thank you so much. I agree.
Great, thank you. So ask everyone to join me in thanking Amber for her wonderful talk. You can do your the little emoji claps and everything.
Thank you. I feel I should bow.
It was an excellent talk, so thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, so we are gonna start our AGM, but I'm gonna